The Quarterly, the Book of Isaiah, Lesson 12. Isaiah 56, Hope for Outcasts. This passage introduces the third and final section of Isaiah's prophecies, covering chapters 56 to 66, which speaks words of challenge and encouragement for those who have returned from exile to Judah and face the discouraging task of rebuilding a new and better society, along with rebuilding their homes, the temple, and the walls of Jerusalem. The exile would not bring about a dramatic change in human hearts, and those who returned found themselves battling selfishness, worldliness, and religious indifference. While they might be thankful for the new exodus that had returned them to their old home, the now of their experience, in a forgotten corner of the Persian Empire, seemed a long way short of the glorious future of Isaiah's prophecies. Was it really worthwhile serving the Lord while awaiting the not yet that was still to come? The glorious future Isaiah had promised earlier was not merely the promise of the arrival of an abstract state of blessing, but rather a person of blessing, the Lord himself, as we see in chapter 43, verses 1 to 2. So too here, the incentive to live a life according to God's law, protecting justice and doing what is right, is not merely in order to have a clear conscience and to be able to sleep at night. Rather, it's because the Lord's salvation is on its way, and his righteousness will be revealed when he appears. It is the hope of the imminent arrival of the Lord that encourages God's people to remain faithful to their callings in every day and every generation. You can see that in Philippians 4:5 or in 2 Peter 3:10 to 14. These faithful ones are the people who are really blessed. That is, the people we should envy and want to be like, as in Psalm 1:1. They may seem very small and unimportant to the world, mere humans, which seems to be the force of the combination of man, Enosh, and son of man, Ben Adam, in the two other places where it occurs in the Old Testament, in Job 25:6 and Psalm 8:5. But in fact, these are the ones upon whom the Lord's blessing rests, who will therefore surely be vindicated when the Lord appears with his salvation, ready to bring in the new heavens and the new earth. It's striking that whereas these people's righteousness is mainly described in rather generic ways, keeping justice, doing righteousness, keeping his hand from doing any evil, they're very specifically described as Sabbath keepers. Now, if we were asked to specify the most important of the Ten Commandments, that's probably not the commandment that would immediately spring to our minds. And the other 9 are also vitally important, covered by those general statements of doing righteousness. And yet the Sabbath commandment was uniquely important in Isaiah's situation, for reasons that are not too hard to discern. Failure to observe the Sabbath was one of the sins that resulted in Israel's exile in the first place, as 2 Chronicles 36:21 tells us. And the Sabbath, with its key placement at the end of the week under the Old Testament order, was designed to lift people's eyes from themselves and the things of this world and place them firmly on the things of the world to come, and on the day when the Lord would finally bring about all that he had promised. Sabbath keepers are blessed, not because they're nitpicky rule keepers, as they're often quite unfairly thought to be, but because they are waiting and hoping for the Lord's salvation to be revealed. Next, the Lord addresses 2 categories of outsiders, who might have thought themselves excluded from the glorious future promises for God's people, the foreigner and the eunuch. Foreigners were by definition outsiders to God's Old Testament people, which was primarily defined in terms of descendants from Abraham. Although there were some outsiders who became part of God's people during this time, notably Rahab in Joshua 2-6 and Ruth in the book that bears her name, it's easy to see why a foreigner might be afraid that the Lord would separate him from his people. Verse 3. particularly if they've been reading Deuteronomy 23, verses 3 to 8. Many of the Psalms celebrate the victory of the Lord and his anointed over the nations. For example, Psalm 2. And in the face of the rebuke of the prominent temptation to intermarriage with Gentiles among those who returned to Judah, as we see in Ezra 9 and Nehemiah 9, this would have been a challenging time for former Gentiles who had converted, who had sought to become full members of Israelite society. Just before the regulations restricting access to God's people for foreigners, in Deuteronomy 23, 3 through 8, there were regulations that also closed the door to eunuchs, in chapter 23, verses 1 to 2. Eunuchs were people, often slaves or prisoners of war, who had been deliberately physically deformed, which qualified them to serve as government officials in the ancient world. That way, they could serve the royal family without being considered a threat to the women in the royal household or a potential rival to the king. So, career-wise, being a eunuch could be a significant advantage. Socially, it was perfectly acceptable. Some eunuchs even got married. Potiphar is called a saris, the Hebrew word used to denote eunuchs, which may, I think, illuminate his wife's behavior towards Joseph in Genesis 37. But religiously, as far as the covenant community was concerned, to be a eunuch was a catastrophe. In Deuteronomy 23:1, all eunuchs were permanently excluded from the assembly of God's people. Their condition was a breach in God's order of creation, in which he created only two sexes, male and female, not three. Their deficiency was emblematic of the deficiencies and shortcomings of sin. Only the pure, only the whole, only the complete could enter into the presence of the King of Kings. In this case, the situation of the eunuchs was especially poignant. In most cases, they would have been made eunuchs by the Babylonians during the exile, including some of the descendants of the Davidic king, just as Isaiah had prophesied in Isaiah 39. Those who might have expected places of honor in the temple as members of the house of David were instead barred from entry into the place where God's worship was carried out. Nor could they have descendants of their own to carry on that line. They were a dry tree, it seemed. Verse 3. Yet the Lord asserted that this present order of things, in which the eunuchs were barred from the temple, would only be temporary. Those who were spiritually faithful, again, marked specifically by faithful Sabbath obedience, as well as more generally holding fast to my covenant, verse 4, would have a future better than many sons and daughters. They would have an everlasting name that would never be cut off in the way that their earthly hopes and dreams had been cut off. And those foreigners who had made a genuine commitment to love and serve the Lord, who were marked out by the signs of Sabbath keeping and holding to the covenant, would also have a future in God's presence, worshipping on his holy mountain. That reminds us of chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. These foreigners would bring their sacrifices and offerings to be accepted on his altar, and they would come and pray in the house of prayer for all peoples. Verse 7. Even though the temple in Jerusalem was the place where innumerable sacrifices and offerings were made, in keeping with the Lord's commands, its primary function was always to be a house of prayer, both for Israel, 1 Kings 8, 28 to 30, and for foreigners who would come there to seek Israel's God, 1 Kings 8, 41 to 43. To have the Jerusalem temple function in this way was the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. That in him all nations of the earth would find for themselves a blessing. The God who had brought his own undeserving people back from exile by pure grace, whether from Babylon or scattered to the ends of the earth, verse 8, could also welcome in the Gentiles to his covenant people by a similar act of his grace. This promise finds its fulfillment in Christ, in whom Jew and Gentile become one and are included together in a single worshiping community, as we see in Revelation 7. In his first coming, Jesus healed the physically broken as a sign of his power to make the spiritually broken whole again. Now the promise of innumerable physical offspring given to Abraham becomes the commission to rear innumerable spiritual offspring for Christ through preaching the gospel to every tribe and nation around the globe, from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria and to the ends of the earth. Acts 1:8. In this way, the church, which Christ founded through his death and resurrection, becomes the true house of prayer for all nations. This promise finds an echo in the story of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8, both a foreigner and a eunuch, for whom there could be no access into the temple in Jerusalem. But when Philip met him on the desert road and found him reading Isaiah 53, he surely showed him how just a few columns later in the scroll, there was good news for him as well. Application questions. 1. Why is the hope of the imminent arrival of the Lord important in the Christian life? 2. Why is Sabbath keeping so important to Christian obedience? 3. Who are the outsiders in your community who are like the foreigners and eunuchs of Isaiah's day in thinking themselves unwelcome to come to worship in your church? 4. How does the coming of Jesus ensure a welcome for those people?